One forbidden letter revealed everything. Welcome to DetectiveMystery. I am your host, Shadow. Drop your city in the comments. I love reading them. Let's begin the story. The afternoon should have been as harmless as a cup of weak tea. In the village of Little Dipping, August sunlight lay politely on everything. On the clipped hedges, on the pale stone of St. Alcuin's church, on the geraniums that Mrs. Weatherby insisted looked better if one talked to them. The annual summer fete was in full, to orderly bloom on the vicarage lawn, trestle tables draped in floral cloths, a crooked row of bunting that refused to hang evenly, and the steady, comforting murmur of people who had known one another's routines for decades and still managed to find them interesting. Miss Jane Marple sat in the shade of a copper beech tree with a plate of seed cake balanced on her lap. She was not, to the casual observer, doing anything at all. Her hands rested lightly on her knitting, which advanced in neat, unhurried clicks. Her pale eyes drifted from stall to stall with the vague benevolence of someone enjoying the day. Yet she was watching. Not the obvious things, such as the competition for best jam. Mrs. Hargreaves had brought 3 jars and was pretending, rather poorly, that she did not care which one. Nor the tombola prizes, a bottle of sherry and a rather sorrowful potted fern, nor even Colonel Bantry's loud opinion that the coconut shy was a corn because the coconuts were glued on. Miss Marple watched the unguarded corners of behavior, the way a young woman's smile arrived too late, the tightness in a man's fingers when his wife spoke, the flicker of annoyance that passed like a shadow and was gone. "Jane, you really must try the scones," said Mrs. Weatherby, lowering herself into the chair beside Miss Marple with the careful dignity of a person who considered sitting down a public performance. "Mrs. Price has outdone herself, though I did notice she used margarine. One can always tell." "I'm sure they're delicious," Miss Marple murmured, and made a small stitch that seemed to satisfy her immensely. Mrs. Weatherby leaned closer. "Have you heard? Mr. Alistair Grant is here, the writer." Miss Marple's needles paused for the briefest moment. "Is he indeed? He's staying at Dipping House with Mrs. Darnley. Can you imagine?" Mrs. Weatherby's eyes shone with the pleasure of outrage, as if Dipping House needed more excitement. "She's been a widow 3 years, and already she's taking in lodgers. A gentleman lodger, very modern." Across the lawn, Dipping House's owner stood near the cake stall, tall and handsome in the smooth way of people who had always been admired. Mrs. Celia Darnley wore a cream hat that made her look serenely prosperous. She laughed at something Mr. Grant said, laughing a little too brightly, Miss Marple thought, and with the stiff poise of someone determined to appear untroubled. Mr. Alistair Grant, the writer, was younger than some had expected and older than others. His face had a tired cleverness to it, as though he had long ago learned that charm could be useful and had never quite forgiven himself for it. His eyes wandered, not at the stalls, but at faces. He looked as though he collected expressions. Near them hovered the village postmistress, Mrs. Ivy Tolland, with a basket of raffle tickets and the attentive posture of someone who never missed anything worth repeating. A little apart stood Reverend Quentin Price, smiling with vicar-like sincerity while his wife arranged her scones in strict rows. And by the church wall, Dr. Humbleton spoke in low tones to a dark-haired woman in a green dress. Miss Elsie Harrow, Aunt who taught at the primary school, and had a way of looking at the ground as if it might suddenly accuse her. "There's been talk," Mrs. Weatherby continued, savouring each syllable, "that Mr. Grant is writing about us." Miss Marple's smile was mild. "Oh, my dear, writers write about everything." "Yes, but one prefers not to be written about," Mrs. Weatherby said firmly. "Not without permission." The fete moved on in its pleasant little circuits. Children shrieked near the lucky dip. The men argued amiably over darts. Mrs. Hargreaves produced a small cry of triumph as her damson jam won second prize. All ordinary, all safe. Then Miss Marple saw it. A small incident that might have been nothing at all. Mrs. Tolland, turning from the raffle table, slipped a white envelope into the pocket of her cardigan. She did it quickly, with the practiced ease of a woman who handled letters all day. But the way she glanced over her shoulder, only once, for only a flutter, was not the glance of someone tidying. It was the glance of someone hiding. Miss Marple's needles clicked again. Mrs. Tolland's basket bumped lightly against the table as she moved away, and for an instant the envelope's corner peeped out like a tongue. "Post," Mrs. Weatherby said, as if reading Miss Marple's thoughts. "It's a nuisance, really, that Mrs. Tolland insists on bringing it with her. She says people might want to post raffle stubs. I call it meddling." Miss Marple said gently, "Perhaps she is simply conscientious." Mrs. Weatherby snorted, unconvinced. At 3 o'clock, tea was served beneath a striped marquee. Cups clinked, spoons chimed, and the vicar offered a few pleasant words about community. Miss Marple accepted her cup and listened to the babble around her, who had seen whom, who was looking tired, who had come into money, who had not. A sudden commotion rose from the far end of the lawn. It began, absurdly. Up, chairs scraping, the villagers neat up, chairs scraping, the villagers neat calm, snapping like a thread. She's in the study," Mrs. Tolland gasped. "Mrs. Darnley, oh, someone must do something." Miss Marple put down her knitting with careful precision. Her expression did not change, but her eyes sharpened. The fete, its bunting, its scones, its polite chatter, seemed suddenly very far away. Miss Marple rose, small and composed, and began to walk toward Dipping House as if she were merely going to admire the roses. The French windows of Dipping House stood open to the lawn. Miss Marple crossed the threshold behind a press of villagers. Reverend Price first, Dr. Humbleton close, and Colonel Bantry puffing as if the whole affair were a personal affront. The study lay just off the hall. It smelled of polish and lavender, but beneath was something metallic and wrong. Mrs. Tolland hovered at the doorway, wringing her hands. "She wouldn't answer," she whispered. "I only came for the envelope, only to put it right." Miss Marple stepped inside and saw Celia Darnley at her desk, half-turned in her chair as if interrupted mid-thought. One gloved hand rested on the blotter, fingers still curved around a fountain pen. The other lay in her lap, palm up. Her head had fallen slightly to one side, and her eyes stared at the bookcase. On the carpet near the desk, a thin sheet of paper lay face down. Another sheet was caught beneath the chair leg. Dr. Humbleton moved in at once, felt for a pulse, lifted an eyelid, then straightened. His voice was quiet, final. "She's dead. Quite recently." A sound went through the room, shock turning at once into eager fear. Mrs. Price clutched her husband's sleeve. Colonel Bantry muttered, "Good God." Miss Marple did not crowd the body. He jerked. A decanter of sherry on the side jerked. A decanter of sherry on the side table and a tumbler half full beside it. Sunlight fell in a hard rectangle across the rug. "We must send for the police," Reverend Price said, trying to sound like a man in command. "I'll ring them," Dr. Humbleton replied. "No one touch anything." No one was touching, Miss Marple thought. So and yet everyone was, by staring, by whispering, by choosing already whom to blame. From the hall came a sharp voice. "Celia, what is this?" Alistair Grant appeared in the doorway, hat in hand. The easy smile he had worn at the fete had vanished. He tried to step forward, but Dr. Humbleton raised a hand. "Not yet, Mr. Grant." Grant's eyes fixed on the slack hand on the blotter. For a moment his face showed plain shock, then it tightened into control. "Who found her?" Mrs. Tolland's mouth worked soundlessly, so Miss Marple answered for her. Mrs. Tolland did. Grant's gaze flicked to the postmistress. "Ivy? I came because I thought I'd misdelivered a letter for Mrs. Darnley," Mrs. Tolland said too quickly, as though reciting, I shouldn't have come in, but the door was open. I called. She didn't answer. What letter? Colonel Bantry demanded. Private, Mrs. Tolland said, and shut her lips. Under the murmur, Miss Marple heard a click, like a careful latch. Well, she turned and saw Elsie Harrow by the French windows, half in, half out, as though unsure where she belonged. Her green dress was creased at the waist where her hands had gripped it. Her eyes were fixed, not on Mrs. Darnley, but on the sherry glass. Dr. Humbleton went to the telephone in the hall. His voice carried, clipped, giving the address and asking for the inspector. Miss Marple moved a step, not toward the body, but toward the desk's edge. The fountain pen had rolled slightly. Eyes were the same thin paper. On the uppermost pages were the same thin paper. On the uppermost sheet, a line near the top had been underlined twice, hard enough to score the page. Miss Marple did not try to read it from where she stood. People underlined what frightened them. Outside, fete noises drifted in, ridiculous against the study's stillness. Alistair Grant stood very straight, knuckles white around his hat. She was alive minutes ago, he said. She was perfectly well. Were you with her? Dr. Humbleton called from the hall. No. Grant's answer came too swiftly. Then he added, I went to my room. She said she wanted to write a note before tea. Miss Marple watched his mouth. The words were smooth. The small muscle at his jaw worked as if he were grinding something down. Elsie Harrow's gaze lifted at last and met Miss Marple's. And in it was a plea, and something like calculation, as if the girl were counting consequences. Miss Marple felt, with her certainty, that Elsie had seen something she dared not speak of. Miss Marple's knitting was still in her hands. One needle had slipped free. The stitch threatened to run. She set it right with a practiced motion, and in doing so noticed, on the rug near the desk, a tiny scatter of grey grit, no more than a pinch of sand. Sand did not belong in a polished study, not unless it had been carried in. Footsteps sounded briskly on the gravel outside, heavy and purposeful. The front door banged. A man's voice said, "Police," and Miss Marple, quite calmly, began to count the faces in the room and to remember where each had been when the afternoon was still, only a little while ago, entirely ordinary. Inspector Mallory was a large man with a patient expression that suggested he had seen most varieties of folly and was rarely surprised by them. No one has touched anything? He asked. No one has touched anything, he asked. Dr. Humbleton shook his head. I confirmed death. Nothing more. Good. Mallory stepped forward, nodding briefly to Miss Marple, whom he clearly recognized, and then to the others. If I may ask everyone except the doctor to wait in the hall, I'll take statements one at a time. There was reluctance. Pausing only long enough to ensure that the fallen sheets of paper remained precisely where they had been. In the hall, the air felt thicker. Mrs. Tolland had sunk onto a chair, pressing a handkerchief to her lips. Elsie Harrow stood near the staircase, rigid as a sentry. Alistair Grant had retreated to the window overlooking the drive, not to staring out, but seeing nothing. The fete's distant murmur had quieted. Word had spread. Faces appeared beyond the open door, hovering in anxious clusters. Inspector Mallory emerged after a few minutes and beckoned to Mrs. Tolland. You found Mrs. Darnley, he said. Tell me exactly how. Mrs. Tolland rose unsteadily. I brought the post to the fete as usual. There was a letter addressed to Mrs. Darnley. I realized I'd put it in the wrong basket. I thought I'd better correct it at once. She swallowed. I came here. The study door was ajar. I called her name. When she didn't answer, I stepped inside. And the letter? Mallory's tone was mild. Mrs. Tolland hesitated. It was on her desk. Opened. So she had received it. Yes. Mallory's eyes sharpened. What was in it? I didn't read it, Mrs. Tolland said quickly. I would never... That wasn't my question. Her gaze flickered, betraying her. I saw only a few words. It appeared upsetting. Miss Marple, seated quietly on a small hall chair, noted the careful phrasing. Appeared upsetting. Not was upsetting. Mallory dismissed Mrs. Tolland and called for Mr. Grant. Grant entered the study with controlled composure. The hall listened shamelessly. Doors in Little Dipping had never been entirely soundproof against curiosity. "You're staying here," Mallory began. "Yes." "For how long?" 3 weeks. "And your relationship with Mrs. McDarnley?" Grant's pause was fractionally too long. "Friendly. She was kind enough to offer me rooms." "Nothing more?" "No." In the hall, Elsie Harrow's fingers tightened on the banister. Mallory's voice carried faintly. "You were seen with her at the fete shortly before her death." "Yes." "We spoke about the raffle. And after that, I went upstairs to my room. I wished to fetch a manuscript. Can anyone confirm that?" Grant's silence answered. Miss Marple folded her hands over her knitting. And alibis in villages were like teacups. Everyone possessed one until it was examined closely. When Grant returned to the hall, his face was pale but composed. He avoided Elsie's eyes. Inspector Mallory next requested Miss Harrow. The young woman moved as if through water. Her voice, when it came, was soft. "I was by the church wall. Dr. Humbleton can confirm." Mallory nodded. "Hush, did you come into the house at any point?" "No." Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the faint smear at the hem of Elsie's green dress, a pale dusting that might have been chalk from the schoolroom or something else. "You knew Mrs. Darnley well?" Mallory asked. "We met," Elsie said carefully. "Did you see her receive a letter?" Elsie hesitated, then, "I saw Mrs. Tolland hand her something, at the fete, just before tea." Mrs. Tolland gave a small gasp from the hall chair. Mallory reappeared moments later, expression thoughtful. "Dr. Humbleton believes Mrs. Darnley died of a sudden cardiac seizure," he announced. "However, I'm not prepared to rule out other causes." A murmur rose. "In the meantime," Mallory continued, "no one is to leave the village." Colonel Bantry bristled. "Surely you don't think—" "I think," Mallory said evenly, "that a woman was alive at 2:30 and dead before 3. She was writing when it happened. There is an open letter on her desk that distressed her. Until I understand why, I will assume that letter matters." Miss Marple felt a small, inward satisfaction. The inspector was not a fool. A constable emerged from the study carrying the fallen sheets in protective paper. As he passed, a corner shifted, revealing a fragment of underlined text. Miss Marple glimpsed 3 words before it vanished from sight. "Not meant to?" Her needles clicked once in her lap, an unconscious punctuation. "Mrs. For her." Silence dropped like a curtain for her. Silence dropped like a curtain. Mallory's gaze fixed on her. "Explain." Mrs. Tolland twisted her handkerchief. "It was addressed to Dipping House, but the name was different. I assumed it was for Mrs. Darnley. I thought perhaps it was formal. But when I saw it opened on her desk, I realized it had been meant for someone else." "For whom?" Mallory demanded. Mrs. Tolland closed her eyes. "For Mr. Alistair Grant." Every head turned. Grant's composure cracked just for an instant. "That's absurd." Miss Marple did not look at him. She was thinking instead of the grey grit on the study carpet and of the sherry glass, half-finished, standing in the sunlight. She was thinking of underlined words and of letters not meant to be read. And when she was thinking that in Little Dipping, as in every village she had ever known, a misplaced letter could be far more dangerous than a loaded pistol. The accusation did not explode, it settled. In the quiet hall of Dipping House, Mrs. Tolland's words seemed to hang in the air like dust motes caught in sunlight. "For Mr. Grant?" Inspector Mallory repeated. Yes. Her voice trembled but did not falter now. The envelope was addressed to Dipping House, as I said, but beneath it, written smaller, was for a G private. I ought to have noticed sooner. I only realized when I saw it opened on Mrs. Darnley's desk. All eyes turned once more to Alistair Grant. His initial shock hardened into something more deliberate. That proves nothing, he said evenly. If the letter was misdirected, Mrs. Darnley may have opened it by mistake. Yet you did not mention expecting a private letter, Mallory observed. I receive many letters. I'm a writer. Miss Marple watched him carefully. His indignation was plausible, but beneath it lay calculation. He was measuring reactions, who believed him, who did not. Did you see Mrs. Darnley open the envelope? Mallory asked Mrs. Tolland. No. I handed it to her at the feet. She slipped it into her reticule. I assumed she would pass it to Mr. Grant later. Instead, she brought it here, Mallory said quietly. Grant's jaw tightened. If she read something not meant for her, so that is unfortunate, but it does not explain her death. No, Miss Marple murmured softly, almost to herself. Not by itself. Inspector Mallory glanced at her briefly, then returned his attention to the group. Dr. Humbleton is conducting a preliminary examination. Until we know more, we consider all possibilities. A constable entered from the study carrying the sherry glass in a folded cloth. Sir, he said, there's residue at the bottom. Our doctor suggests it be tested. A ripple of unease passed through the villagers. Poison? Colonel Bantry demanded. Perhaps, Mallory said. We shall see. Grant laughed once, sharply. This is absurd. Celia had a weak heart. Everyone knew that. Did they? Miss Marple's voice was gentle. He looked at her, irritation flashing. Yes. Miss Marple inclined her head slightly, but said nothing more. Elsie Harrow shifted, as if words pressed at her lips. Finally she spoke. Mrs. Darnley looked upset when she left the fete. I noticed. You noticed? Mallory prompted. Yes. She had just spoken with Mr. Grant, and then with Mrs. Tolland. Mrs. Tolland flushed. I only gave her the letter. And what was said between Mrs. Darnley and Mr. Grant? Mallory asked. Grant's tone cooled. We discussed nothing of importance. Elsie's gaze met his, steady now. She asked if you are certain. A silence followed. Certain of what? Mallory asked. Grant did not answer at once. So of a trivial matter. Miss Marple's knitting needles moved again. Calm, rhythmic. Certain. Such a small word, and yet it often concealed the largest anxieties. Inspector, she said mildly, might I suggest that the letter itself may illuminate matters? It will be examined, Mallory replied. Until then, speculation serves little purpose. But human nature serves a great deal, Miss Marple said almost pleasantly. Mallory's mouth twitched faintly. Indeed. Doctor. Humbleton emerged from the study, removing his spectacles. I can say this much, he announced. If poison was involved, it was swift. There are no signs of struggle. No sign she suspected? Mallory asked. None. Miss Marple considered the image of Celia Darnley seated at her desk, pen in hand, sunlight across the rug. No struggle, no alarm. Either she trusted what she drank, or she did not know it was dangerous. Who poured the sherry? Mallory asked suddenly. Grant spread his hands. There is always a decanter in the study. But who last handled it? Mallory pressed. No one answered. Mrs. Tolland cleared her throat. I dusted in there this morning. The decanter was full. And now? The constable glanced back toward the study. Half empty, sir. Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward Elsie Harrow's shoes. A faint trace of pale grit clung to the edges of the soles. Sand, she thought again. There was no sand on the vicarage lawn. "Miss Harrow," she said softly. "Now, did you walk near the river this afternoon?" Elsie started. "No." "The riverbank is sandy this time of year," Miss Marple observed. "The school children often play there." Elsie's face paled. "I did not go there today." Grant turned sharply toward her. "What has that to do with anything?" "Perhaps nothing," Miss Marple replied. Inspector Mallory's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "Miss Harrow, were you in this house before the alarm was raised?" "No," but the denial came too fast. A knock sounded at the front door. Another constable entered, holding a small folded paper. "Sir, this was found in the grate in Mr. Grant's room, partially burned." Mallory took it, unfolding the fragile sheet carefully. Only a fragment remained legible. "If she reads it, everything will come out." Grant stepped forward. "That proves nothing. Writers discard drafts constantly." "Indeed," Mallory said. "Yet this appears not a draft, but correspondence." Miss Marple felt the pattern tightening. A letter not meant to be read. A woman certain or uncertain of something. Sand where it did not belong. A half-empty decanter, and fear. Not fear of exposure alone, but fear of someone else's reaction. Inspector Mallory folded the charred fragment. "Until the contents of the original letter are fully examined, no one leaves Dipping House." The villagers shifted uneasily. Miss Marple looked once more at Alistair Grant. For a fleeting instant, she saw not indignation, but calculation turning toward desperation. And she thought, with quiet certainty, that someone in this house had not intended murder at all, but they had intended silence. The word silence seemed to echo in Miss Marple's mind long after it had faded from the room. Inspector Mallory ordered that the principal parties remain inside Dipping House while the rest of the villagers were gently but firmly dispersed. The fate dissolved into subdued clusters beyond the gate. Their voices lowered, eyes fixed upon the house as though tragedy might still be visible at an upstairs window. Within, the hall felt narrower. The late afternoon light had shifted, losing its golden assurance. A constable stood at the door of the study. Another lingered near the staircase leading to the bedrooms. Mallory gathered them together once more. "The partially burned paper found in Mr. Document is reviewed. In the meantime, document is reviewed. In the meantime, I wish to clarify certain movements." He turned first to Elsie Harrow. "You maintain you did not enter this house before Mrs. Tolland raised the alarm?" "Yes," she said, though her voice had thinned. "You were near the church wall?" "Yes, with Dr. Humbleton." She hesitated. "He left before I did." "Doctor," Humbleton frowned. "I returned to the marquee for tea. Miss Harrow remained behind." Miss Marple observed the exchange quietly. Elsie's composure had altered. Fear had given way to resolve. That, too, was telling. Mallory's gaze shifted. "Mr. Grant, after leaving Mrs. Darnley at the fete, you went directly upstairs?" "Yes." "And remained there?" "Yes." "Alone?" "Yes." Mallory regarded him for a long moment. "The sandy residue in the study does not match the vicarage lawn," he said casually. "It resembles riverbank sand. The same sand was found on the back step." A flicker crossed Elsie's face before she suppressed it. "The river path runs behind Dipping House," Mallory continued. "One could approach unseen." Grant's composure faltered slightly. "Are you suggesting someone came from outside?" "I am suggesting," Mallory replied, "that someone may have." Miss Marple's eyes drifted to the hem of Elsie's dress again. The faint grit there was not recent from the fete, and it had dried into the fabric. "Inspector," Miss Marple said gently, "may I ask whether the letter was entirely intact?" Mallory nodded. "Yes." Mrs. Darnley had underlined a passage. "The letter appears to accuse Mr. Grant of plagiarism." of basing a forthcoming novel upon private information confided by Mrs. Darnley years ago. A collective intake of breath. Grant's face drained of color. That is nonsense. The writer of the letter, Mallory continued, threatens exposure unless Mr. Grant withdraws the manuscript. Miss Marple folded her hands. And was it signed? No name, merely initials. Which were? Mallory's eyes flicked toward Elsie. E.H. The hall fell silent. Elsie Harrow did not deny it. Instead, she lifted her chin. Yes, I wrote it. Mrs. Tolland gasped. Elsie. I never meant for Mrs. Darnley to read it, Elsie said steadily. It was for him. For what purpose? Mallory asked. Because the manuscript was mine. The words struck like a stone dropped in still water. I confided in Mrs. Darnley 2 years ago, Elsie went on. I had written a story about my family, about things that happened before I came here. She encouraged me. She said she knew someone who could help. Her gaze fixed on Grant. He read it. He praised it. And then he changed it. He used it. Grant's voice rose. That is absurd. Ideas are not property. It was not an idea, Elsie said quietly. No, it was my life. Miss Marple felt the threads aligning. Motive did not always require money or romance. Sometimes humiliation was sufficient. Mallory spoke carefully. You confronted Mr. Grant? Yes, he denied it. I wrote the letter. I intended to force him to acknowledge it. And today, Mallory prompted. I gave the letter to Mrs. Tolland to deliver, Elsie said. I did not trust myself to hand it to him. Mrs. Tolland nodded weakly. She asked me to post it, but I thought, since he was here, I would save the stamp. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. Such economies had consequences. You saw Mrs. Darnley open it, Mallory said. Yes, Elsie whispered. She read it at the fete. I saw her face change. And then, Mallory pressed, she left. I followed. A murmur stirred again. I only meant to speak with her, Elsie insisted, to explain that I never intended to distress her. You entered by the river path? Mallory asked. Yes, and this, that she had trusted the wrong that she had trusted the wrong person. Did she accuse Mr. Grant? Mallory asked. Yes. Grant made a sharp sound. Celia was melodramatic. Elsie ignored him. She poured sherry for both of us. She said we must think calmly. Did you drink it? Mallory asked. No, I set mine down, and I could not swallow. Miss Marple's mind sharpened. And Mrs. Darnley? She drank, Elsie said. She seemed calmer afterward. Then she began writing something, a note, I think. And you? Mallory's tone was very quiet now. I left, Elsie said. I thought it best. Leaving her alive? Yes. Miss Marple considered the image again. Celia at her desk, pen moving, sunlight slanting. If Elsie had not drunk the sherry, and Celia had, then the poison, if poison there was. Silence settled once more, heavier than. Silence settled once more, heavier than before. Miss Marple knew then that the letter had indeed been dangerous, but not in the way anyone first supposed. And somewhere between accusation and intention, someone had made a fatal calculation. A fatal calculation, Inspector Mallory repeated slowly, as though testing the weight of the phrase. Alistair Grant gave a short, incredulous laugh. You cannot seriously be suggesting that I poisoned Celia in order to silence a schoolteacher. No one has suggested anything yet, Mallory replied evenly. We are establishing sequence. Miss Marple sat very still, her knitting idle in her lap. The pattern was almost complete. Only a few rows remained. She had always found that human behavior followed patterns too, provided one observed the dropped stitches. Mr. Grant, Mallory continued, were you aware that Miss Harrow intended to confront you today? Grant hesitated. She has been emotional before. Answer the question. Yes, he said tightly. She hinted as much. And did you anticipate that Mrs. Darnley might read the letter? No. But again, the answer came a fraction too quickly. Miss Marple recalled the burned fragment found in his grate. If she reads it, everything will come out. Not a draft, the inspector had said. Correspondence. A warning, perhaps, of half empty when found, she said. Doctor. It was half empty when found, she said. Dr. Humbleton, do you know when it was last filled? This morning, the doctor replied. Mrs. Darnley kept a well-stocked sideboard. And who had access to the study during the fete? Miss Marple asked. Anyone could have entered, Grant said impatiently. The house was open. Indeed, Miss Marple agreed. But not everyone would know the decanter was there. Mallory's gaze sharpened. Mr. Grant, you have been staying here. You would know. Yes. And Miss Harrow? Mallory asked. I've been in the study before, Elsie admitted, to discuss the manuscript. Miss Marple inclined her head. Then both of you were familiar with the room. A constable entered quietly and handed Mallory a folded slip. The inspector read it, expression unreadable. The doctor has completed a preliminary test, he said. Next, there was a significant quantity of digitalis in the sherry. Dr. Humbleton stiffened. Digitalis? That is no accident. Quite, Mallory agreed. It would act swiftly, especially in a woman with a known weak heart. Grant stepped back as though struck. That is monstrous. Miss Marple's gaze rested upon him. Yes, she said softly. It is. Mallory continued. Digitalis is not easily obtained without prescription. Dr. Humbleton. The doctor frowned. I prescribe it occasionally. See, there are small quantities in the dispensary. And are they accounted for? They should be. Miss Marple watched the doctor carefully. His discomfort was professional, not guilty. Yet medicine, like gossip, moved quietly through villages. Miss Harrow, Mallory said, did you handle the decanter? No. Did Mrs. Darnley leave the room while you were present? Elsie shook her head. No, as she remained seated. Then the poison must have been introduced before either of you entered, Mallory concluded. Grant exhaled sharply. Then I'm cleared. Not necessarily, Mallory said. You were alone in this house shortly before Mrs. Darnley returned from the fete. Grant's eyes flashed. Are you suggesting I slipped upstairs to poison her drink in anticipation of a letter I had not yet seen? Miss Marple considered that carefully. Anticipation. Yes, that was precisely the point. You knew the letter existed, she said quietly. Grant turned on her. How? The burned fragment, she replied. If she reads it, everything will come out. Those are not words of surprise. They are words of fear. Silence. Mallory looked at Grant. Did you receive prior warning of this letter? Grant's composure began to crack. Writers correspond. Miss Harrow is not the only person who imagines theft where there is none. Answer the question, Mallory said. Grant's gaze flicked toward Elsie. It feared she might believe it. Grant said feared she might believe it. Grant said nothing. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. You feared she would confront you, perhaps even demand restitution. Grant's hand tightened around his hat. Celia was practical. She would have listened. Would she? Miss Marple asked. Elsie spoke. Letter, where were you? In the house. Letter, where were you? In the house. Specifically? In the study. Another silence fell. You were in the study, Mallory repeated slowly, before Mrs. Darnley returned. Yes. And alone? Yes. Miss Marple saw it then. The fatal calculation. Not an elaborate plan, but a swift, desperate decision. When a man who believed exposure would destroy him, A decanter at hand, a known weakness of the heart. You intended the sherry for Miss Harrow, Miss Marple said quietly. Grant's head jerked up. That is absurd. You believed she would follow Mrs. Darnley, Miss Marple continued. You knew her temperament. You knew she would demand answers. Elsie stared at him, horror dawning. And so, Miss Marple said, you ensured there would be none. Grant's voice broke. I did not mean... Mallory's expression hardened. Did not mean what? Grant swallowed. I only meant to frighten her. A small dose, enough to make her ill, to discredit her accusations. Dr. Humbleton stared in disbelief. Digitalis is no trifling matter. Grant's composure shattered entirely. I misjudged. I thought Celia would not touch it. She rarely drank before dinner. But today she did, Miss Marple said softly. Grant covered his face. The hall seemed to shrink around them, and Inspector Mallory's voice was steady. Alistair Grant, I am placing you under arrest on suspicion of murder. Miss Marple resumed her knitting as the constable stepped forward. Outside, the light had faded into evening, and within Dipping House, the consequences of one misplaced letter had at last unfolded completely. The constable's hand closed firmly around Alistair Grant's arm, but for a moment the arrested man did not seem to feel it. He stood very still, staring at the carpet of the hall as though the pattern there might rearrange itself into some kinder explanation. I did not mean to kill her, he said hoarsely. You must believe that. Inspector Mallory's voice remained measured. Intent will be determined in due course. For now, you will come with us. Grant allowed himself to be led toward the door. As he passed Elsie Harrow, he paused. Whatever he had meant to say dissolved into silence under her steady gaze, and there was no triumph in her expression, only a stunned grief, as though the consequences of her own letter weighed upon her more heavily than any accusation. Outside, the villagers had not dispersed entirely. They drew back as Grant emerged between the constables, whispers rising and falling like wind in dry grass. The fete bunting still hung over the vicarage lawn, absurdly festive in the dimming light. Miss Marple followed as far as the threshold of Dipping House, while she watched the police car depart in a scatter of gravel, then turned back inside. The hall felt emptier already, as if the drama had drained its color. Inspector Mallory removed his hat again and faced the small remaining group, Dr. Humbleton, Reverend and Mrs. Price, Mrs. Tolland, and Elsie. There will be formal statements taken, he said. Miss Harrow, you may consider yourself a witness, not a suspect. Mrs. Tolland, I must ask that you accompany us tomorrow to clarify the handling of the letter. Mrs. Tolland nodded weakly. If only I had posted it as I was asked, she murmured. Miss Marple laid a gentle hand on her sleeve. One cannot undo a small decision once it is made, she said softly. But one can learn from it. Mrs. Tolland's eyes filled. I only wish to be efficient. Yes, Miss Marple said. Efficiency can be a dangerous virtue. Inspector Mallory glanced toward her with faint amusement. You saw it early, Miss Marple. I saw fear, she replied, and fear is rarely tidy. When the inspector had gone and the formalities were concluded, Dipping House seemed suddenly too large. The study door remained closed. Within, the decanter had been removed, the blotter taken as evidence, the letter sealed. Elsie lingered near the window, staring at the garden where only hours before Celia Darnley had laughed in the sun. I never wished her harm, she said quietly. Miss Marple joined her. Of course not, my dear. I thought she would help me, Elsie went on. I thought she would insist he make it right. And she intended to, Miss Marple said gently. That is why she wrote a note. Elsie looked at her. What note? The one she began before she collapsed, Miss Marple replied. Inspector Mallory showed it to me briefly. It was unfinished, but clear. Elsie's breath caught. What did it say? It said, Miss Marple answered, that she believed you, and that she would see the matter resolved. Tears slipped down Elsie's cheeks, silent and unrestrained. Miss Marple regarded the fading light beyond the window. Mr. Grant miscalculated not only the dose, she said quietly. He miscalculated character. He assumed Mrs. Darnley would protect him out of affection or convenience. Instead, she chose integrity. Elsie drew a trembling breath. And paid for it. Yes. They stood in silence for a moment. At last, Reverend Price approached hesitantly. Miss Marple, he said, do you believe justice will be done? She considered that. Justice, she said, is not always neat. But truth has a way of insisting upon itself. Outside, the last of the villagers drifted homeward. The bunting stirred in the evening breeze. The village would talk of letters and manuscripts, of ambition and betrayal. It would weave the story into its fabric, as villages always did. Mrs. Tolland paused at the door before leaving. It was such a small thing, she said again, delivering it by hand. Miss Marple's expression was kind but firm. In villages, my dear Mrs. Tolland, small things are never small. When at last Miss Marple returned to her own cottage, twilight had deepened. She set her knitting basket upon the table and sat by the window, looking out at the familiar lane. Human nature, she reflected, was endlessly consistent. Pride, envy, fear, these were the true instruments of tragedy, and the digitalis had merely done its mechanical work. The true poison had been humiliation and desperation. She resumed her knitting and completed the final row with careful precision. In Little Dipping, the day had begun with seed cake and gossip beneath a copper beech tree. It had ended with handcuffs and grief. And somewhere in the quiet of Dipping House, a letter that no one was meant to read had told the truth at last. The following morning broke with a deceptive clarity. Sunlight returned to Little Dipping as though the previous day had been nothing more than a passing shower. The bunting had been taken down from the vicarage lawn, the trestle tables stacked away. Only the faint scuffs in the grass and a forgotten paper cup beneath the hedge hinted that anything unusual had occurred. Yet the village did not resume its rhythm so easily. Miss Marple walked slowly along the lane toward Dipping House, her gloved hands folded over her reticule. She had been invited, formally this time, by Inspector Mallory, who wished to clarify certain details before concluding his report. Inside the house, the air still carried a trace of disturbance. Furniture had been straightened, the study restored to order, but absence lingered like a shadow in the corners. Mallory greeted her with quiet respect. "Thank you for coming, Miss Marple. There is one matter that troubles me." "Only one?" she asked mildly. He allowed himself the faintest smile. "So the timeline is sound." Mr. Grant admitted to introducing the digitalis into the decanter while alone in the study. He believed Miss Harrow would be the one to drink it. His confession aligns with the evidence. "Yes," Miss Marple said. "Yet there is something incomplete," Mallory continued. Mrs. Darnley began writing a note after drinking the sherry. If the dose was as strong as Dr. Humbleton indicates, she would have felt its effects almost immediately. Miss Marple nodded. Indeed. She underlined a passage in the letter before that, Mallory went on. The line reads, "She was never meant to know." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened slightly. "Mr. Grant insists he meant only to discredit Miss Harrow, not kill her," Mallory said. "Yet the phrase suggests foreknowledge, perhaps of something beyond plagiarism." Miss Marple took a seat near the window, considering. "May I see the letter again?" she asked. Mallory handed her the carefully preserved document. To know." Miss Marple read the surrounding text. "She was never meant to know." Miss Marple read the surrounding lines quietly. The accusation of stolen manuscript, the threat of exposure. And then, in the final paragraph, a reference to the earlier draft you persuaded her to destroy. Miss Marple looked up. "Inspector," she said softly, "did Mr. Grant ever admit to urging Ms. Darnley to destroy anything?" Mallory frowned. "No. Yet Miss Harrow entrusted her manuscript to Mrs. Darnley 2 years ago," Miss Marple continued. "If there was an earlier draft, one perhaps more personal, more revealing, its destruction would remove proof of authorship." Mallory's expression grew intent. "You believe Mrs. Darnley knew more than she revealed?" "I believe," Miss Marple said gently, "that she may have been complicit, at least initially." Mallory was silent. "Consider," Miss Marple went on, "a woman of her standing, a charming writer lodging in her home, a young school teacher with literary ambitions. It might have seemed harmless at first. An exchange of ideas, perhaps even flattering. And later," Mallory prompted. "Later," Miss Marple said, "she may have realized the extent of what Mr. Grant intended to do." Mallory leaned forward. "If she encouraged the destruction of an original draft, that would explain her sense of responsibility." "Yes. And the underlined phrase?" "She was never meant to know," Miss Marple repeated. "That may not refer to Miss Harrow at all." Mallory's eyes narrowed. "It may refer," Miss Marple said quietly, "to Mrs. Darnley herself." The implication settled heavily between them. "You think Mr. Grant feared that Celia Darnley would discover the full extent of his deception?" Mallory said slowly. "Yes, not merely plagiarism, but manipulation, and he persuaded her to destroy evidence, perhaps assured her it was unnecessary." Mallory considered this. "And when Miss Harrow's letter arrived, it forced a reckoning," Miss Marple finished. "Mrs. Darnley realized she had been used. She began writing a note, perhaps confessing her part, perhaps intending to restore what she could." Mallory exhaled, which would have ruined him completely. "Yes." Silence filled the study. Outside, a blackbird called from the hedge. "Then his calculation was not merely to silence Miss Harrow," Mallory said. "It was to prevent Mrs. Darnley from speaking." Miss Marple folded the letter carefully. "Fear is rarely so simple as we first imagine, Inspector. It multiplies." Mallory nodded slowly. "His confession did not include this motive. He may not admit it even to himself," Miss Marple said. There was a knock at the study door. Dr. Humbleton entered, looking grave. "The final report confirms it," he said. "The dose was lethal. No accident of measurement." Mallory inclined his head. "Thank you." When the doctor withdrew, Mallory turned back to Miss Marple. "You believe he intended to kill her?" "I believe," she said gently, "that he introduced a quantity of poison sufficient to ensure silence, whoever drank it." Mallory absorbed this without comment. After a moment, Miss Marple rose. "The village will settle again," she said. "It always does. And observe." As she walked back along the lane, the sunlight seemed softer than before. Dipping House stood quiet behind her, its windows reflecting the morning sky. The letter had not merely accused, it had revealed. And in revealing, it had drawn into the light not only a thief of words, but a woman who had nearly allowed truth to be erased. In Little Dipping, peace would return, but beneath it would lie the memory of a sentence underlined twice and the cost of believing that something was never meant to be known. In the weeks that followed, Little Dipping adjusted itself as villages always did, carefully, curiously, and with an undercurrent of relentless recollection. The newspapers arrived first, in thin columns carrying thick implications. Prominent author arrested. Village tragedy linked to literary dispute. Names once spoken over seed cake and jam now appeared in print. The villagers read in private and discussed in public, each retelling smoothing or sharpening details according to personal inclination. Miss Marple accepted these conversations with patient civility, offering neither embellishment nor contradiction. She had long ago discovered that truth, once revealed, required no assistance. Dipping House stood closed for a fortnight. A distant cousin arrived to settle Celia Darnley's affairs, moving through the rooms with brisk efficiency. The study was cleared, the decanter removed, the desk polished until it shone with a brightness that felt almost indecent. One afternoon, Elsie Harrow came to call on Miss Marple. She looked thinner, though her posture had regained a certain steadiness. Ours were seated by the window. For what? My were seated by the window. For what, my dear? Miss Marple asked. For seeing what others did not. Miss Marple's smile was faint. I merely listened. Elsie glanced down at the pages in her lap. Inspector Mallory told me about the note Mrs. Darnley began. He said she intended to make a statement about the manuscript. Yes, Miss Marple said gently. She meant to correct a wrong. Elsie nodded. I found this among my papers. It is a copy, an earlier draft. I'd forgotten I kept it. Miss Marple's eyes softened. That was wise. I nearly destroyed it myself years ago, Elsie admitted. Mr. Grant convinced me it was sentimental, unpolished. And now I know better. They sat in companionable silence for a moment. Do you believe he ever meant to kill her? Elsie asked suddenly. Miss Marple considered the question with care. Thus intent is rarely as clear as consequence, she said at last. He intended control. He intended silence. When one plays with such things, outcomes may exceed intention. Elsie absorbed this. I have been thinking, she went on, about Mrs. Tolland. She blames herself. Ah, Miss Marple said softly. Guilt is a most adhesive emotion. It was a simple decision, Elsie said. Hand delivering the letter. Yes, and yet everything turned upon it. Miss Marple looked out at the lane, where autumn had begun to tint the hedges with gold. In villages, she said, lives are closely woven. A single thread pulled may alter the whole pattern. Elsie rose after a time, leaving the ribbon-bound pages on the small table. I mean to finish it, she said, with quiet resolve. Properly. I'm very glad, Miss Marple replied. When the young woman had gone, Miss Marple untied the ribbon and read a few paragraphs. The voice was clear, observant, and unsentimental. If it understood small towns and the hidden tensions beneath polite exchanges, it understood pride. Miss Marple smiled faintly and retied the ribbon. Later that week, Inspector Mallory stopped by on his way through the village. The case is proceeding, he said. Mr. Grant has altered parts of his confession, but the evidence remains solid. And the motive? Miss Marple asked. He now claims he panicked, Mallory replied, that he feared professional ruin. Miss Marple inclined her head. Ruin is a powerful spectre. Mallory studied her. You believe Mrs. Darnley understood that at the end? Yes, Miss Marple said quietly. I believe she did. And you think she would have spoken? Without doubt. Mallory nodded slowly. Then perhaps justice is not so incomplete. When he had gone, Miss Marple returned to her knitting. The completed garment lay folded beside her chair, its pattern uninterrupted, each stitch precisely where it ought to be. Outside, and the village moved in gentle rhythm once more. Children passed on bicycles. Mrs. Tolland resumed her rounds at the post office, a little more deliberate in her deliveries. The vicar's sermons acquired a subtle emphasis on integrity. Dipping House was eventually let to a retired naval officer and his wife, who cared nothing for manuscripts and preferred gardening to literary society. The study became a sitting room, the decanter replaced by a bowl of chrysanthemums. Time, as ever, had softened the edges. Yet sometimes, when Miss Marple walked past the copper beech tree on the vicarage lawn, she remembered the moment when ordinary sunlight had given way to alarm. She remembered the glimpse of a white envelope and the faint, telling glance over a shoulder. A letter not meant to be read had revealed more than theft. It had revealed the quiet complicity of admiration, the corrosive fear of exposure, and the cost of underestimating conscience. Miss Marple finished her knitting and set it aside. Human nature, she reflected, was neither wholly dark nor wholly light. It was simply consistent. Pride sought concealment. Truth sought expression. And in the delicate balance between them, even the smallest misstep could prove fatal. The village bells rang for evening service. Miss Marple rose, serene as ever, and stepped out into the fading light of Little Dipping, where peace had returned, though never again quite so innocently as before. Late autumn settled gently over Little Dipping, drawing a thin veil of mist across the hedgerows and turning the last of the leaves brittle underfoot. The village had resumed its habitual rhythms so completely that a stranger might never have guessed a death had disturbed its summer fate. Yet for those who had stood in the hall of Dipping House that afternoon, memory lingered like the faint scent of lavender polish. The trial concluded before winter. Alistair Grant's defense rested heavily upon panic, upon professional desperation, wounded pride, and what his counsel termed an ill-considered attempt to frighten rather than to harm. But the measured clarity of chemical evidence, the burned fragment in his grate, and the deliberate introduction of digitalis into a communal decanter told a colder story. The jury required little time. When the verdict was delivered, Inspector Mallory wrote briefly to Miss Marple. "Justice," he said, had followed its proper course. Miss Marple read the note beside her small coal fire and folded it with a quiet nod. Justice in the courts was one matter. Justice in the human heart was another, and seldom so tidy. A week later, she was invited to take tea at the newly reopened Dipping House. The retired naval officer and his wife had settled briskly into residence, but they had preserved one tradition, an autumn gathering for the village, modest and well-intentioned. Miss Marple accepted. The afternoon bore a faint echo of the fete months earlier. Cups clinking, polite laughter, the murmur of speculation carefully restrained. Yet there was something gentler in the air, as though the village had learned caution. Elsie Harrow stood near the mantel, speaking quietly with Mrs. Price. There was colour in her cheeks again. A publisher in London, it was whispered, had expressed interest in her manuscript. The earlier draft, once nearly destroyed, had become proof rather than vulnerability. Mrs. Tolland hovered near the doorway with the tea tray, her movements deliberate and exact. If she felt the weight of past efficiency, she carried it with humility. Inspector Mallory, passing through on official business, had accepted a cup. He inclined his head to Miss Marple as she joined him by the window. "It seems settled," he said quietly. "On the surface," she replied. Mallory's gaze followed hers across the room. "There is one thing I have often considered," he said. "If Mrs. Darnley had not opened the letter, if it had reached Grant directly, do you think matters would have ended differently?" Miss Marple contemplated the question. "I do not think so," she said at last. The letter was not the cause. It was merely the catalyst. Mallory waited. "Mr. Grant's fear had been growing for some time," she continued. "Miss Harrow's earlier warning, the destruction of the draft, the knowledge that Mrs. Darnley's conscience might not remain comfortably silent. These were threads tightening long before that afternoon." "And the underlined sentence?" Mallory asked softly. "She was never meant to know," Miss Marple repeated. "He believed he could manage knowledge, decide who deserved it, who could bear it. That was his fatal error." Mallory nodded slowly. "Control. Yes. Writers, like many people, grow accustomed to shaping narratives. He forgot that real lives resist such editing." Across the room, Elsie laughed softly at something Reverend Price had said. The sound was unforced, unguarded. Miss Marple watched her with quiet satisfaction. "Mrs. Darnley," Mallory said, "has been remembered kindly." "As she should be," Miss Marple replied. She erred, perhaps, in trusting admiration too readily, but when truth confronted her, she chose correctly. Mallory studied her. "You believe she intended full confession?" "I do," Miss Marple said simply. Her unfinished note was not defensive, it was restorative. Silence rested between them, companionable. Outside, a light wind stirred the garden. The chrysanthemums by the window nodded gently, replacing the memory of a decanter that had once stood there. When tea concluded and the guests dispersed, Miss Marple lingered a moment at the threshold of the house. She looked down the path that led toward the riverbank, so at another's urging. A glass poured in at another's urging. A glass poured in haste. Each, insignificant alone, became irrevocable when woven together. She thought, too, of the pattern she had finished knitting weeks before. A single dropped stitch could unravel an entire row if not corrected swiftly. And pride had been the dropped stitch in Alistair Grant's character. Small at first, then widening under strain until the whole garment of his reputation came apart. Miss Marple drew her shawl more closely about her shoulders and began the slow walk home. The village bells rang faintly in the distance, steady and untroubled. Little Dipping would remember. It would speak of manuscripts and misjudgments, of conscience awakened too late. It would take care, perhaps, with future letters and quieter ambitions. And Miss Marple, serene and observant as ever, carried with her not triumph but understanding. For in every peaceful village, beneath bunting and borrowed laughter, lie secrets waiting to be read. Some are never meant to be known, but truth, like ink pressed twice beneath a single sentence, has a way of insisting upon itself.